Christopher and I went on his first Boy Scout camp out this weekend, and he's been a Cub Scout for a couple of years, but moved over to Boy Scouts a few months ago, and this was this first overnight one there. So I went along with him in the Lincoln troop, and we camped at Camp Far West, which is 20 or 30 minutes from here. So it looked perfect. Like, wow, I could stay the whole time and just get up early and get to church straight from the campground on Sunday morning. And it was a camporee, which is a sort of Scout Olympics where troops compete against other troops and have recognition at the end. And it was a lot of fun. We were just all out there in tents. However, when we were getting ready to go, Christopher went to a carnival at his school, and the wind kicked up, the easy ups started blowing away, and rain was coming down hard, and Mary looked at me and said, "You still going to that?" I said, "We're still going." And by the time we met up with the troop and all got out there, the wind had let up, and we did have pretty nice weather. Now, I was just thinking, imagine it's 2,000 years in the future. Some of you might be saying it can't be 2,000 years in the future because Jesus will come back before then, but just indulge me for a minute. Just imagine it's 2,000 years in the future. Every country has changed leadership and borders multiple times. Most of what we have written down has only a fraction of it survives. And maybe there's some fragments of the Boy Scout handbook left, and people start talking about what it means to be a scout. It might be a foreign concept and take a lot of explaining of what it means to do scouting and the learning program that they have with merit badges in ranks and so forth. And it might be in different cultures looking at the movement, might be a hard to understand concept of what it is, looking backward into the past, into a different time and a different culture. And sometimes it's like that when we look at the Bible, particularly as we've been going through Luke. We get to a passage today in chapter 14 where Jesus is talking about discipleship and what it means to be a disciple. And there's a lot of cultural and historical baggage that goes with that looking back at it into a different culture, these words written in a different language, and discipleship training looking a lot different today than it does then, leaves some explaining to do. So this morning we're looking at what did discipleship mean to the disciples of Jesus in the New Testament in the first century, and what does it mean now? When studying the Bible, the first thing you have to do is understand what it meant in its original context. And until you understand that, it's very hard then to do the work of what does it mean now? What does it mean in my life? I believe that a lot of people read the Bible and say, what does it mean to me? You can't always understand what it means to me until you understood what it meant then. What did the original writer want the original reader to understand? Because if you're reading it and coming up with something totally different, then you're probably not interpreting it right. It can't possibly mean something completely different now than it meant then, if it could not have possibly meant that then, of what the original writer meant for the original reader to understand. So there is some of that in this passage. So if you're following along, and it'll be on the screen, Luke chapter 14, starting at verse 25. Large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and turning to them, he said, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple." That's a tough one. That's a tough one. And some of you are saying, wait a minute, didn't Jesus call us to honor our father and mother? Doesn't the Bible say, husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church, laying his life down for the church? Aren't you supposed to love your children? I think we all are pretty confident it's not saying that if you're going to be my disciple, you need to hate everybody. We're not Westboro Baptist Church here that goes and pickets funerals of service people and anything and everything that we disagree with. There are some people out there, hopefully not too many of them, that, boy, I just hate everybody. I only like my dog and 2 or 3 people. That's it. You're probably not on the list. And that's okay. Some people are into it, like, well, I'm a jerk and you can love me or hate me and I don't care what you think. That's not what Jesus is saying. There's what you call a Hebrew Semitic idiom, which is a figure of speech. And we have a whole lot of figures of speech in English and in every language that doesn't always make a whole lot of sense. For instance, probably a few of you have had Spanish class or know some elementary Spanish. And what do people say often, when somebody's thanked? Say gracias, which means thank you in Spanish, and people are always saying de nada, and literally that means of nothing. Kind of like it's nothing, but it's saying of nothing. And that doesn't come across in English. It wouldn't make any sense. Let's say I'm standing back there and somebody says, "Thank you, Pastor, for the good sermon." And I say, "Of nothing." Oh, what? No, I said thank you for the nice sermon. Of nothing. You say that doesn't make any sense. The pastor's goofy. But it's an idiom or figure of speech in Spanish. Now, we have plenty of them in English. We're probably not even sure what they mean, but this Semitic idiom or Hebrew idiom of hating, and this was written in Greek, so it adds another layer, the New Testament, but the idiom of hating your mother and father, wife, children, brothers and sisters when you come to Jesus doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but the idiom was that if you love one person more than another, it's to love one and hate the other. Now, let's say you have 5 aunties and your aunts. You love them all, but maybe the one aunt lived with you guys or raised you or spends lots of time with you, and that's your favorite aunt or your favorite uncle. The figure of speech would be, because that one's your favorite, you love that one and you hate the others. Commentaries Bible commentaries do a pretty good job of explaining this, because otherwise it's pretty hard to make sense of. So, of course, it's understood that hopefully you love your father and mother, your wife and children, and your brothers and sisters. And then it says, yes, even their own life. Again, Jesus isn't calling us to hate our life. Like, I hate life, I hate living, I just hope it is over soon. No. There's, you need some mental health treatment if you feel that way. But Jesus is saying, if anyone comes to me, he's talking about salvation, and he's talking about discipleship. So if anyone, this is a crowd following him, and Jesus attracted great crowds, but he wasn't always a crowd pleaser. Sometimes he would say hard things, and some of the crowd would go away, and he would, see who's left by the time he's done preaching. It's an interesting way to preach. I'd like to try it sometime. I'm going to lay it on thick and heavy and see who's left. But Jesus seems to do that quite a bit. And in the Bible, in the New Testament, it seems that it's different than the American church. Nobody ever seemed to care about numbers of how many there are in attendance. It seemed to care a whole lot more about doctrinal and church purity, and that they were doing things the right way, and that people were living for the Lord. And it seemed to be that if you weren't willing to do that, then there's the door. And so Jesus was saying, if anyone comes to me and does not hate father, mother, wife, children, brothers and sisters, and even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. And this needs to be unpacked. In the culture, discipleship meant a very specific thing, and everybody knew what it meant. See, people in the time and the place, they had Jewish law, but they were ruled by the Romans, and they also had Roman law. And so everybody, for the most part, had a religious upbringing. Why? Because the Sabbath, Saturday, we now have the day of resurrection, Sunday, that we meet, but the Sabbath was a day that was set aside for worship. And guess what? It was against the law for anything to be open that day, unless it was something maybe really essential. It would be like if it would be against the law to have any stores open. Nobody was allowed to go to work. You weren't allowed to do it. It was illegal. It was against the law. And if you were found out working or doing labor, there were often serious consequences for it. And I'm talking civil penalties. In fact, people had been in the Old Testament put to death for violating the Sabbath and doing work on the Sabbath. So with the Sabbath, people would worship the Lord. People would gather with other people and read the law of the Lord. By the first century, there were synagogues, often a couple synagogues in small towns where people would gather and worship the Lord and read from the Old Testament, much like we do weekly in church. But if everything else was closed, there'd be nothing to do. You couldn't stay home and watch TV. There was no printing press, so most people didn't have many books. Most people didn't have a personal Bible. You would have to go to the synagogue or to the temple and hear it being read to you. So there was that. It reminds me of, I've done a few missions trips to Mexico and to Native American reservations, and we would do vacation Bible school, and we would do revival services at night. But guess what? It seemed like the whole community turned up in these remote places because there wasn't a whole lot else to do. It was something to do. And so the way they educated children then, you would go to school and you would study, and a lot of it involved religious instruction, usually about until you turned 13 years old. And then you would go to work. So, Cameron, you would already be well into your career. Christopher, you'd probably be done with school and starting a job. Raphael, you'd be well into your career. You'd probably have mastered a trade by now. So that's kind of how it worked. And so, but if there were some really good students that wanted to continue studying with the rabbi, then it would be an honor to be invited by them if you'd been a really good student to continue study with them. And the rabbis didn't get paid for their synagogue service during that time. So often they would have another trade. And young men, when they would finish school, would go and usually apprentice with somebody, usually their dad or their uncle, or maybe you arrange with somebody else that needs help, such as a blacksmith or a farmer, for your sons to go and work with them. And so the rabbi would have a job, but in their time off, they'd spend time teaching a group of disciples who were themselves preparing to be rabbis. And the format was often they would give them a question to work on, and they would debate each other and work the problem for days. And then the rabbi would then sit them down and give them the correct answer. And you were required to agree with the rabbi. Their answer and their teaching on it was definitive, end of discussion, end of debate. And in being their disciple, you pretty much agreed to submit to them in everything. You might help them out around the house or with their job. The disciples would do the menial tasks for them. And it was required that if you were going to be a disciple, that you would tend to not disagree with your teacher, that you would set aside all of your preconceived ideas and adopt the views of the rabbi. And that's very important here to understand that as we're talking about, okay, if that's what discipleship was then, what is discipleship here today? Well, there are a lot of Christians out there that take the Bible and say, well, I believe a lot of things in the Bible, but I don't really agree with this or that. If you're going to call yourself a disciple of Jesus, you take the whole Bible. And there are parts of it when you first get familiar with that you're going to say, I don't agree with that. I don't like that part. Well, here's the thing with discipleship. You don't have to like it. Your opinion is inconsequential. The Word of God is authoritative, and if you're going to be a disciple, you have to say, well, I don't like that part. Well, I mean, let's just be frank and admit it. I don't always like everything I read in the Bible. Maybe you won't hear a whole lot of preachers say that, but there's certain parts, you get to it and you might feel like I wish that verse wasn't in there. We all do it because we're sinners. Because we're sinners, and a holy God giving us these book and these guidelines don't always agree with what we want. But my will has to give way to thy will if I'm going to be a disciple. I have to take the hard teachings with the easy and the good teachings. And it's It's kind of like when you're growing up, your mother told you to do something and you say, why? What answer do you give most of the time? Because I'm your mother and I said so. Right? And that's how some of it works. There's certain parts we don't agree with, that we don't like, and I'm God, and this is what you're to do, and this is how you're to act. And if you tell God, I don't like it, I believe God would say, you don't have to, that's okay, you don't have to like it. But it's here. But you still have to do it. And that's how it worked for discipleship. So Jesus saying, if anyone comes to me and doesn't hate father, mother, wife, children, brothers, and sisters, and yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. So they would have known what that meant, that you didn't have to full on hate your family, but your family had to subordinate to the rabbi. That now you have to adopt the views of your teacher. If what your teacher tells you to do from this point forward would supersede what your mom and dad tell you to do, even, or wife and children. I mean, there were rules of engagement, so to speak. If you were a disciple of a rabbi and you were married, you had to get permission from your wife to go away with him for more than a few weeks. If he was on a missions trip or a speaking tour. So there were guidelines to this, but it was saying that, hey, your discipleship comes first if you're a first century disciple. Now, a good example of this in my life is when I was in seminary. For a while I worked in the church as a youth pastor, and I was in seminary working on a Master of Divinity. It's usually 3 years after you graduate from college that ministers, if they're able, study at a seminary. And I also had a job at a group home for teenagers and children, and most of them had been in and out of juvenile hall or mental hospitals, or both. Was the highest level of care where you're not, locked in juvenile hall or in a locked in mental health hospital. And in that job, I'd been working that job for 2 years, and I really liked that job. But one of my supervisors said, hey, Tuesday morning there's going to be a training on how to drive the van, and it's mandatory that you be there. I said, well, I can't be there. I have final exams in graduate school, in seminary. He said, well, it's mandatory and you have to be there, so I'm going to expect that you're going to be there. And I said, no, I'm taking final exams in seminary. I'm not going to be there. But you have to be there. It's mandatory. I said, well, I'm not going to be there because I have final exams. And that was more important to me. She says, well, if you don't show up, you can't work here anymore. I said, well, then I guess we're done. But she was bluffing, and I still kept my job. But I didn't know she was bluffing, and I was willing to lose that job over it, or perhaps what probably really would have happened if it was enforced, maybe I wouldn't have been allowed to work there until the next training came along, because it was kind of an emotionally hard job, and they were always hiring new staff. So I figured maybe I'd need to sit out for a month or two, but that would have been okay. But it's one of these things of Jesus was saying, choose your priority. Choose your priority. If you want to be a disciple of Jesus in the first century, your discipleship and your teacher had to be the priority. That in the idiom that you pretty much had to hate everything else. It was saying even your own life being your own preferences and your own views needed to be put aside. And then he goes a step further, and whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. Now, carrying your own cross was a Roman cultural thing. The Romans crucified people, and we all know what that means. You get nailed to that and you die. And part of their cruelty, that seems like in that day and age, like people would have meetings to, maybe government meetings, to say like, what's the cruelest things we can do to people? And crucifixion was one of their top brainstorms. But part of being crucified is, they'd whip you and make you carry your own cross to the place of being executed. It's just kind of a cruel joke in seminary, a cruel joke there to have to take it to, the cemetery and be crucified. So saying like whoever does not carry their cross, that doesn't mean like you carry your cross, you wear a nice little gold crucifix. No, it's saying like you gotta die to yourself and adopt my views, is what it's saying. Or you have to follow me even unto death. Or you can't be my disciple. So what is discipleship today? There are a lot of different ideas about that. Some churches have discipleship programs, and they all look a little different. Is being a disciple attending church every week? Is it going through a book? Some churches have, maybe like a 4-part discipleship class of 1 hour apiece. It's like a 4-hour program. Or is it you join a small group and you go through a book together? Is it attending Sunday school? Sunday school only probably goes back about 150 years. Before that, it didn't exist. Is it, some people have it meeting for coffee regularly with a more mature Christian where you talk about your faith? Is it a program? It is all of these things, yet they all seem to pale in comparison to first century discipleship and what that entailed. Seemed to be pretty serious business. So Jesus was talking about the seriousness of being a disciple, and churches, some people take their discipleship very seriously, some don't. Religiously in our culture, of course, a lot of people aren't raised with any religious background anymore. Sociologists and a lot of Christian writers have adopted terms, and I've talked about it, nones, N-O-N-E, like none, you have nothing, you have no religious background, no preconceived ideas. And then there's cultural Christianity, which is, you're not saved, but Christian traditions are a part of your family, your culture, and your upbringing. Probably the most famous atheist of our day that debates theologians and has written a lot of books on atheism is Richard Dawkins. And Richard Dawkins is European and in England, and he wrote like, even though I don't believe in God or the existence of God, I'm a cultural Christian. I celebrate the Christian holidays. I celebrate Christmas and Easter and the festivals and enjoy the old hymns. And he was worried about like Islam taking over the culture in Europe and saying that I don't believe in God, but I like being a cultural Christian. He doesn't want cultural Christianity in churches to go away, because Western civilization and Western culture is built upon the Bible and the church, the Judeo-Christian background. If that goes away, our culture and world looks very different. So there are a lot of people that don't believe in God that are cultural Christians. And then there is committed Christianity, those that are in church most of the time. And perhaps if we were looking at what Jesus was talking about of being his disciple, perhaps that even goes a step further with the seriousness he's talking about it. And so Jesus gives a pretty high standard of being his disciple, that everything else in your life for that time of discipleship in the first century subordinates to being a disciple. So in Jesus' teaching, through this teaching that we have here in Luke chapter 14, we have to understand the seriousness of it, so we could look at that and, am I a disciple? How's my discipleship going? It's a pretty high bar, and I stand here with you saying, like, this is a pretty high bar. Perhaps we all fall short of that some of the time, and we can stand here and be convicted about that together. It pales in comparison to people that are like, well, I'm a Christian, and I'm going to show up for Christmas and Easter. Might fall really short of what it means to be a disciple. Now, we must not look down on those people, because, hey, the people that just come a few times a year, they still have a seed of faith, and they're still looking for the Lord. So we need not look down upon them or shame them, as we're all in different places in our spiritual journey. We have to encourage them along in their discipleship as well. And then Jesus says, suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Verse 28. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? For if you lay a foundation and are not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule you, saying, this person began to build and wasn't able to finish. Sometimes you see that in neighborhoods, houses that are half built, or we go to Tahoe about once a year, and up by where we stay on the top of Kingsbury Grade, there's a hotel that's half built. It's all like metal framed in, but it's just been like that for years. You don't know. You always wonder what happened. Was it running out of money? Was it too many neighbors complaining? Was it a problem with permits? On Fittyman Road, on the way to our house, there's been a chevron that kind of went up. It got half built, and then it sat for about a year. Wondering, like, what happened? I don't know what happened, but all the neighbors are just wondering what happened. Why did they stop building it? Well, it looks like they're back finishing it finally. We're happy to see, as well as a pizza place that's right there attached to it. But it's saying if you want to build a tower, Jesus doesn't say what for. A tower might be you build it for security, to have a watchtower, or you build a tower to store grain. But it's saying if you lay the foundation and start building it, but then you're out of money for materials and labor, Jesus is saying people are going to ridicule you. You're going to be laughed at. This person began to build and wasn't able to finish. But Jesus is saying this in the context of discipleship. Like you started being a disciple and then quit. Count the cost. Do you ever what are the things that you've taken seriously to finish? Maybe maybe at school is a good model. You start college or a formal program that has very high standards. You count the cost to make sure that you'll be able to finish and not drop out. Right? Something that you take seriously, something that's becomes a priority in your life, even when things get hard. Or suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Won't he first sit down and consider whether he is able with 10,000 men to oppose one coming against him with 20,000? So, yeah, war then, when war was fought on foot, that all the technology we have now, the numbers mattered. The numbers mattered, and he's saying that they would sit down and count and see how many do we have and how many are coming to fight us. Interesting, Jesus gave that analogy. In the time of King David, a census was taken to see, what is our military power, and the Lord got very angry with them for taking a census, because he's saying, your numbers don't matter. All that matters is that the Lord is on your side. But Jesus was talking to them and using a worldly analogy to make a spiritual point. So if a king has 10,000 soldiers and is going against an army which outnumbers them 2-1, coming against him with 20,000, verse 32, if he is not able, he will send a delegation while the other is still a long way off and ask for terms of peace. In the same way, those of you who do not give up everything you have cannot be my disciples. Saying, your faith and your love of Jesus come first if you're going to be a disciple. Salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? You can't recharge salt. Saying it is fit neither for the soil nor for the manure pile, it's thrown out. Saying it's garbage there. Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear. And so we end this passage with that. And we're reminded of the Great Commission that Jesus gave to his disciples. Mark 16:15, Jesus said to them, post-resurrection, prior to his ascension into heaven, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. He who believes and is baptized will be saved, but he who does not believe will be condemned. But then Matthew records it. Jesus came to them and said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations. So the disciples were then fully trained, and they were supposed to go make other disciples, who then make disciples, who then make disciples, who then make disciples, and then here we are in church as a result of them and that lineage. But then when you read this, boy, make disciples. Making disciples was a big commitment on the part of the teacher and the part of the student. Serious business Jesus is talking about. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always, even to the end of the age. And when we see what discipleship meant then, boy, we have to really think about it as a church. How are we making disciples? We have to think about it in our individual life. Man, where are my priorities? And how do I measure up to Jesus' standards? Wow, so probably given us all a lot to think about this week.